Voiceover begins, calm but dripping with dry irony. There's a certain smell in the air. It's not democracy, nor is it the faint whiff of international diplomacy doing its job. No, it's more like the smoldering scent of another great Western delusion, quietly going up in flames. For years, we've been told a very simple story. The West good, the rest confused. Democracy equals virtue. NATO equals peace. The IMF just a friendly neighborhood loan shark with a passion for spreadsheets. And of course, anyone resisting this shiny global order must be a dictator, a lunatic, or Russian. Sometimes all three, but lately the narrative seems to be glitching. A small African nation dares to say no to a Western-backed trade deal. And suddenly it's all sanctions, concerns about human rights, and we're monitoring the situation closely, which in political English usually translates to, we're furious someone disobeyed us and we're figuring out how to punish them. And then there's this man, Traoré, young, sharp, annoyingly articulate, not playing by the rules, not kissing the ring, not interested in being the West's favorite client, which begs the question, what the hell is happening? Why is a man with no nuclear weapons, no luxury watch collection, and no offshore accounts refusing the most powerful empire in history on camera? Tonight, we follow that camera, and we ask, what if the old script isn't working anymore? For decades, Western foreign policy has operated like a high-budget theatrical production. There's the glittering set, global summits, red carpets, neatly pressed suits, champagne in one hand and human rights reports in the other. There's a well-rehearsed script too, democracy, free markets, and development aid. And of course, the all-important cast, the wise Western leaders benevolently guiding the unruly global South towards the promised land of liberal capitalism. Now enter Africa, not the real complex, deeply strategic Africa, but the Africa of Western imagination, a continent of problems to be solved, resources to be partnered, and governments to be guided. Or failing that, overthrown politely. The formula was simple. If you played ball, signed the trade deals, smiled at the G7, and opened your economy wide enough, you got the applause. Aid packages, security guarantees, maybe even a selfie with a European commissioner. But the moment you strayed off script, things got awkward. Take Burkina Faso, not exactly a country you'd expect to appear on the front page of Western headlines, unless there's a coup or a mine. But here it is, and why? Because its new leadership, led by a man barely old enough to rent a car in the United States, has dared to ask questions that were never meant to be asked. Questions like, why should we sell gold at colonial prices while importing toothpaste at IMF interest rates? Why is every Western development project led by a consultant from Geneva with a PowerPoint and no passport stamps? And why does every freedom-loving nation have military bases in countries they can't pronounce? These aren't revolutionary ideas, they're common sense. But in the theater of Western diplomacy, common sense is subversive, dangerous even, because the whole performance relies on silence, on quiet obedience, on the idea that we know best. And suddenly, here's a character who walks on stage, tears up the script, looks directly into the camera and says, actually, no, we're not interested in being managed anymore. That's not just inconvenient, that's threatening. Because if one country breaks character, what's to stop the others? Now, when you picture a revolutionary leader, you might imagine someone weathered by time, perhaps a Che Guevara clone, with decades of rebellion etched into his beard. But Traoré, he's 36, not young for a president, young for a dentist. In fact, if he were British, he'd still be figuring out if it's worth switching from Tesco Club Card to Nectar Points. Yet here he is, heading a sovereign state, leading a coup not just against the government, but against a mindset. To the West, he seemed like a glitch in the matrix, young, articulate, and, worst of all, unapologetic. He didn't arrive with the usual diplomatic modesty, no long-winded references to historic partnerships, no performative gratitude, no careful nods to Washington or Brussels. just a straight spine, a military uniform, and an expression that said, "I know exactly what game is being played, and I'm not playing." At first, they tried the usual tactics. Ignore him, he'll fizzle out. A military man without political seasoning, surely he'll collapse under pressure. But then he didn't. Demonize him. A dictator, an opportunist, a Russian puppet. But the accusations didn't stick. Not because he was perfect, but because he was asking questions too uncomfortable to dismiss. Co-opt him, send envoys, offer deals, invite him to summits with titles like Reimagining Africa's Future, which are invariably hosted in Berlin hotels with more mineral water than minerals. But Traoré, and here's where the theater truly trembled, didn't flinch. Instead, he looked the West squarely in the eye and did something almost taboo. He spoke to his own people, not the International Monetary Fund, not the British Broadcasting Corporation, not the United Nations Special Rapporteur for obvious observations. He stood before his citizens, many of them young, angry, disillusioned, and he said, "This country is yours. It doesn't belong to France. It doesn't belong to the World Bank. And it sure as hell doesn't belong to the NGOs handing out rice while shipping out gold." That's when things changed, because suddenly it wasn't just about Traoré. It was about the crowds in Ouagadougou waving anti-French banners, about young Africans quoting Thomas Sankara instead of Elon Musk, about a leader who wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was flipping the table entirely. Now, whether you agree with him or not is beside the point. In the world of geopolitics, style matters. Tone matters. And Traoré's tone was crystal clear. We're not waiting for permission anymore. The Western world, so used to managing African narratives, had stumbled upon a character they couldn't rewrite. A man too young to play the role of elder statesman, too defiant to play the role of friendly partner, and far too aware to play the fool. In short, the most dangerous kind of man in modern diplomacy. One who doesn't need your approval. Washington sends a senior envoy. Crisp suit, diplomatic smile, probably carries around a folder labeled Stabilization Strategy, Africa Edition. Paris dispatches their own representative, silk tie, colonial nostalgia, faintly perfuming the air. Even London, still mourning its empire over bad tea, sends someone to see if there's a constructive dialogue to be had. And what does Traoré do? He shows them the door. Not in the dramatic North Korean kind of way. Oh no, this was Burkinabe style. Measured, calm, impeccably polite. Like saying, "Thank you for your concern, but we've decided to keep our dignity." First came the closure of French military bases, long-standing installations that had become as permanent as bad government contracts. To French officials, these were symbols of partnership. To Burkinabe citizens, they were symbols of occupation, with better branding. Then came the demand, French troops, pack up, get out. No more counterterrorism operations, no more lectures about shared values from people who still have Algerian skulls in their museums. The French media lost it. Liberation screamed about rising anti-French sentiment. Le Monde asked, "Has Burkina Faso gone rogue?" And back in the Élysée Palace, Macron reportedly looked at his advisors as if someone had stolen his bicycle. But Traoré, he didn't blink. He just held a press conference and said, "We do not hate the French people. We simply refuse to be ruled by French interests." Oof! That wasn't just a slap. It was a mic drop. And it wasn't just France. Traoré's government told the United Nations to stop meddling, politely suggested the European Union take its humanitarian concerns elsewhere, and sent a warm but firm no, thank you to every Western offer wrapped in conditional aid. Then came the headlines in the West. Burkina Faso falls under Russian influence. West losing grip on the Sahel. Democracy in danger. Because of course, if a country in Africa isn't following Western instructions, it must be under the influence of Moscow. There's no way Africans could possibly want sovereignty all on their own, right? But here's the kicker. Traoré wasn't running into Russia's arms. He wasn't pledging loyalty to Beijing. He was doing something far more terrifying to Western policymakers. He was standing alone. No strings, no patrons, just a message. You had your chance. Now we'll find our own way. And that's the slap. Not a violent one, not even an angry one, but a slow, deliberate, civilized humiliation. The kind where you realize too late that the one you underestimated just flipped the script. So next time someone tells you that Burkina Faso is losing direction, remind them that maybe, just maybe, they've finally found it. Pan to the podium. 100 journalists hold their breath. This was supposed to be the handshake photo for the ages. Instead, well, history had other plans. It was a moment scripted by the West. President Trump, freshly unbanned from social media, swaggering in with the charm of a used car salesman, offering an unprecedented deal to Africa's new rising star, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The room buzzed with anticipation. The CNN reporter had already half-written the headline, "Trump brokers new alliance with Africa's youngest leader." Spoiler, he wouldn't need it. Trump strutted in with his classic pitch, a grin, a thumbs up, and something suspiciously resembling a bribe wrapped in diplomatic ribbon. We're talking about real investment, tremendous investment. You like gold, Ibrahim? We'll help you mine it better, American style. Just keep China and Russia out? Easy. It was the old playbook. Offer dollars, promise stability, dangle security contracts, and hope no one notices the fine print. You're still not in charge. But Traoré, unlike so many before him, didn't blink. He didn't lean in for the handshake. He didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't even bother to read the glossy folder labeled Pathway to Prosperity, American Partnership in the Sahel. Instead, he stood, calm, firm, and devastatingly precise. My people are not pawns. We're not an extension of anyone's battlefield. Burkina Faso belongs to Burkinabe. Boom. Silence. Not the polite kind. The stunned, awkward. Did he just say that to Trump's face? Kind. A few Western journalists chuckled nervously. One State Department aide reportedly spilled their Starbucks. But Traoré wasn't done. You come to speak of democracy, yet support those who rob us of it. You offer investment, yet leave us with debt and dependence. We are not rejecting America. We are rejecting arrogance. It was diplomatic judo, and Trump had just been flipped flat on his rhetorical back. Suddenly, the cameras weren't capturing a handshake. They were capturing a reversal, a turning point where the global South looked the global North in the eye and said, "Not today." To the untrained observer, it might seem reckless. Why turn down help? But to those watching from Accra, Bamako, or even Brixton, it wasn't recklessness. It was a reclaiming of dignity, live, uncensored, and unscripted. Traoré didn't storm out. He let Trump leave first. A quiet, calculated alpha move, the kind you don't need to explain to your enemies. Back in Washington, the spin machine sputtered. It was a misunderstanding. Translation issues. We still look forward to dialogue. But the truth was clear. Traoré had just drawn a line in the sand and made sure the world saw it happen. And as the footage spread online, clipped, memed, reshared with subtitles in a dozen languages, one thing became obvious. A new generation of African leadership had arrived, and it had no patience for imperial nostalgia. Not even if it came with a Trump Tower gift basket. The day after Traoré's televised rejection of Trump, the world woke up with a hangover. Not the champagne kind, the we might have lost Africa kind. The White House scrambled. PR teams worked overtime, desperately trying to rebrand the incident as a misunderstood exchange between friends. CNN called it a diplomatic curveball. Fox News called it a threat to American values. And Sky News? Well, they were still trying to pronounce Burkina Faso correctly. Europe, meanwhile, gasped in colonial flashbacks. The French Foreign Ministry issued a coldly worded statement. France remains a committed partner to Burkina Faso. Recent developments are regrettable. Translated from diplomatic French. How dare they? Paris was especially bitter. After all, they'd spent decades cultivating La France-Afrique, a carefully managed relationship built on debt, diplomacy, and just the right amount of military assistance. Now, the captain from Ouagadougou had thrown the script into the Sahel wind. One French official, off the record, was heard muttering, "First Mali, then Niger, now this? What is in the water down there?" No, monsieur, it's not the water. It's the awakening. In Berlin, the response was more analytical. A panel of well-funded think tanks convened to issue a 37-page report concluding absolutely nothing. Burkina Faso's recent diplomatic choices signify a paradigmatic shift within the post-colonial strategic architecture of... Never mind. The EU issued a united response that was, as always, delayed by 3 days and watered down by 17 rounds of edits. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the mood was very different. When Traoré rejected the American proposal, a few glasses were quietly clinked in Zhongnanhai. So, he doesn't like the West telling him what to do? Interesting. China had no illusions about shared values or democracy building. They offered roads, railways, and digital infrastructure. No lectures, no morals. Just loans. And lots of them. And now, with the West stumbling, the red carpet was being rolled out in reverse. Comrade Traoré, we respect your sovereignty. Let us discuss friendship, and perhaps 5G towers. The chessboard was shifting. In Traoré, he was no pawn. In Washington, Trump's team floated the idea that Traoré had been compromised by foreign influences. Cue the usual suspects: China, Russia, Iran, TikTok. But the truth was more uncomfortable. Traoré wasn't anyone's puppet. He was what the West feared most: an African leader with backbone, broadband, and a broadcast crew. And the people? They were watching. In Nairobi, students shared clips of his speech under the hashtag #NotYourPuppet. In Johannesburg, posters went up reading, "Traoré said no, so can we." Even in London, second-generation Africans cheered. About time someone told them where to shove it. The empire, it seemed, had no clothes, and the former colonies weren't afraid to laugh anymore. The world was no longer playing by the West's rules. The reaction wasn't just diplomatic, it was existential. For the first time in a long time, Africa had stopped asking for a seat at the table. It had started building its own table. And suddenly the old guard, from Washington to Westminster, was left wondering, what if they don't need us anymore? Spoiler, they don't. But they'll gladly sell you some gold. At market rate, no discounts for nostalgia. Voiceover. Cameras caught the handshake that never happened. The smirk that shook embassies. And the silence that said more than 1,000 press releases. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man the West once ignored, now stood at the center of a geopolitical theater, and he wasn't reading from their script. Let's be clear, the world didn't change overnight. Washington still hums with lobbyists. London still clutches its nostalgia like a damp Union Jack. And Paris, still polishing the bust of Napoleon while wondering why everyone's so ungrateful. But something did change. Subtle, seismic, irreversible. For the first time in decades, a leader from Africa said no, and meant it. He didn't hedge. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for capacity building or technical assistance or whatever euphemism is fashionable at the OECD this week. He just said, "We have our own vision. Your money isn't needed. Your troops can leave." That wasn't just defiance, it was liberation. Not from the colonizer's flag, but from the colonizer's frame of mind. Now let's talk about the rules-based international order. That sacred phrase. The mantra of the well-dressed diplomats. The tagline of the think tanks. It sounds noble, doesn't it? But who made the rules? It certainly wasn't Burkina Faso, or Mali, or the Congo. They were too busy being divided, indebted, or destabilized when the rules were written. The truth is, the rules were always flexible, but only for the ones who wrote them. When America bombs a country without UN approval, strategic deterrence. When France supports a coup in Francophone Africa, stabilization. When Russia does the same, aggression. When China invests billions in African infrastructure, neocolonialism. When the IMF does it with strings attached, structural adjustment. The hypocrisy isn't subtle. It's printed on letterhead and stamped with blue ink. Traoré didn't just reject a deal, he rejected the theater of false choices. The idea that a country must choose between two empires, that sovereignty means signing on the dotted line, but only after someone else wrote the terms. What he demanded was not money or weapons or applause. What he demanded was respect. And that, dear viewer, is where the West panicked. Because respect means letting go of control. It means you don't get to lecture someone about democracy while selling arms to their dictator neighbor. It means your former colony no longer sees your approval as currency. And what happens when more leaders realize that? This is the part where the world gets uncomfortable. If Burkina Faso can walk away from Washington, if Mali can tell Paris to mind its own business, if the global South begins to act like it belongs at the head of the table, or builds a new one entirely, then the whole illusion falls apart. Because the West never really ruled with power alone, it ruled with narrative. It told a story where it was the savior, the civilizer, the indispensable partner. Africa was either a victim or a charity case, but never an equal. Now the story is changing, not because of war, not because of ideology, but because someone dared to say, that story doesn't work for us anymore. So what's next? Will the West adapt? Possibly. Will it retaliate? Probably. But the more it clings to its fading relevance, the faster it slips away. This isn't about Burkina Faso alone. It's about a global shift in confidence. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa. Nations long treated as chess pieces are flipping the board. And in doing so, they're exposing the fragility of a system that called itself order, but delivered chaos in a suit and tie. And the British viewer, what should you take from all this? That your leaders still think the sun hasn't set, that your media still can't pronounce Ouagadougou, that your history classes still end in 1945, as if nothing inconvenient happened after. But perhaps it's time to learn the new map, one where influence isn't imposed but earned, where sovereignty isn't a gift but a fact, where the empire is a museum exhibit, not a foreign policy model. Captain Traoré didn't just embarrass Trump, he embarrassed an entire worldview. A worldview built on eternal dominance, now crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. And as he walked away from that press conference without a deal, without a dollar, but with his head held high, the message echoed louder than any headline. We're not here to play your game anymore. We're here to build our own. And suddenly, the world felt different, because it was.